Hello. I'm going to be making some solar panel racks today from scratch. They will be ground mount solar racks and they will be made of steel. A main goal is that the racks are simple and easy to build. They will also have a simple to use adjustable tilt if seasonal adjustment is desired. But this way of building racks might not be everyone's cup of tea. This is going to be for someone who's got more time than money.
Or actually likes working with the metal as a hobby.
Because there are kits out there that you can get that take care of a lot of these junctions that I'm going to be making from scratch that take all the time.
Some with specially made aluminum rails. But with this project, I'm sticking with steel. It's cheaper, common, locally sourced. Fits my budget and plans exactly. I am not a structural engineer, not a credentialed, licensed structural engineer. So, if you proceed ahead and make your own racks following some of these ideas, you're on your own as far as if they're structurally sound, approved by a structural engineer.
There might be some welding, but not necessarily. Cutting? Yeah, that kind of cutting. And some drilling too. Later in part 2 there will also be drilling, but that will be drilling into the ground to mount the racks. And then finally we get to assemble the racks. But just one more quick thing about the design of this rack. Notice that there are only 2 legs, 2 poles going into the ground rather than 4. It's a lot simpler overall in that way.
Well, alright, then let's do a walk-around little overview tour.
The first thing I want to mention is these posts, these metal poles. These are very strong for their diameter. They are Schedule 40, which means they're really 3.5 inches on the outside diameter, and the wall thickness is around 1/4 inch. Very thick, very strong for its size.
And it's good that they are strong because there are only 2 of them holding up the whole rack. And this pipe is recycled from scrap metal yard and it's in excellent condition.
Now this short beam here is to set or adjust the rack's angle to the sun. They can be adjusted seasonally or just left alone. Then at the top of the pole, that's where most of the metal working is going to happen to create the slot in the pipe and add on that little mountain looking truss in the middle. Here's a look at the other pole. You can see that that mountain looking truss is only on one side of each pole. One for each pole seemed adequate to do the job, even though it is not symmetrical, having the truss plate just on one side of the beam. As for the actual beams going across, those are what they call unistrut.
It can be purchased at electrical supply houses and larger hardware stores.
The greatest thing about it to me is that it's galvanized, coated, so it's going to resist rust fairly well. And the kind that I got has these oval holes every few inches all the way along, so you don't have to drill those when you want to put this together. Now these unistrut, superstrut type brands of channel have their own specialized blocks and connectors to mount these together or mount other items on them. But this example here is just ordinary hardware store nuts and bolts and washers, and sometimes that's just fine. And looking at that bolt, you can see it's necessary to use a thick, big flat washer to cover over those big holes and get a good grip. Now looking at them on the ends, you can see the 2 types. The one on the left here is the main one we're using. It's a little over 1 5/8 square. And we're using this other shallower version of it to hold up the seasonal tilt angle on the rack. These 10-foot links I was getting were $25 or less. All right, so now I want to talk about the center here of this pole and the unistrut junction, this pivot point. And this piece of metal in the center here I'm calling a truss. Let's take the truss away and show what things look like then. So imagine the weight of the panels pushing down on this, and then maybe some heavy snow load or heavy wind load. The weakest place is right there in the middle at the green arrow, and if nothing is done to reinforce that middle area, the beam is going to flex and could bend or break. So that's the idea of a truss in the middle here to help reinforce it and make it stronger. This is my version of a truss. It could be made out of any number of different methods and pieces of steel, etc., but this was the one I decided on. The center line is actually 3 inches further down. And doing that provides enough space between the truss and this brace that goes across the middle of some solar panels. That 3-inch offset provides the clearance. Making these slots, these cuts in the pipe, and letting this slant down, it's going to vary by where you live and if you even care about adjusting your panels for the winter and summer sun direction. The more directly these are pointed at the sun, the more power they will make. So if I need every watt of solar I can get, I want to make sure these are pointed as directly at the sun as they can be. But if I got plenty of solar to spare, then maybe I'll just set them for equinox time of year and never move them. And if that were the case and I didn't need to adjust them, well then I would just skip making the truss.
And that would save doing a lot of extra work, as we'll see up ahead.
And instead just put another beam across this space here. And you see how that forms another truss, an upside down giant one. Very strong. The rack tilt could still be moved. It just would be a little more complicated to do. But care will have to be taken during adjustment because this beam without a truss up on top would be temporarily very weak while these lower two arms are loose during the adjustment. A final thing to mention on our walk around is the size. Unistrut beams are 10 feet long, and the panels that I got, 3 of them side by side with a little space in between, fits on a 10-foot unistrut perfectly with no cutting. And there's a good chance, if I'm careful, that the solar panel mounting holes and the unistrut holes will match up in a pattern that I don't need to drill any holes to connect the panels to the rack.
Oh yeah!
Now this dimension here could be a bit bigger and it could be a lot smaller. It just depends on the solar panel size. And the 3 panels roughly weigh 150 pounds plus the weight of the rack. And these solar panels, they are 300 watts for a total of 900 watts, more like 700 in the real world. So here's those pipes in the raw.
I got 8 of them 20 feet long from a scrap metal yard, and they all have these random little outlets. And I tried to make it to where there was at least one of them that gets buried in the concrete in the ground.
And that just helps bind up the pole. I need to cut the poles, and I want one end of the pole to be smooth, flat, and square with the sides. So I'm going to use this circular saw with a metal cutting blade.
And I am wearing protection for my eyes and ears every time I'm using a power tool. And believe it or not, these sparks can and do start wildland fires, shop fires. So I've actually got a backboard off camera that all these sparks are spraying into. And I've got a hose nearby, a shovel, and a fire extinguisher. It's no joke.
I cover all trash cans nearby that have combustibles in them. And if I'm outside, I wet everything down with a hose nearby that's combustible.
Before and after I'm done. And some jurisdictions where you live might restrict this kind of work to only days that are designated burn days.
Well, to make these cuts come out square, it takes a bit of practice, but it helps to have the saw's table be 90 degrees square to its cutting blade. And some better saws will have an adjustment here actually where you can tilt the table to get it more exactly square. It makes it more likely that your cut through the pipe will come out square and true to the side of the pipe. As for the other end of the pole that goes into the ground, I just took my torch and rough cut them off.
A more relaxed cut.
So on the other end of the pipe that we cut off square and flat, we're going to be cutting the slots for the unistrut beam. Laying the beam on the pipe, it pretty much automatically centers itself down the length. So all you have to do is mark it.
And you notice that this already has a truss welded on it, but a truss is optional, as is welding, as I've mentioned.
So you can just ignore the truss for now.
It's just going to make the cut a little wider.
Remember, this depth of cut is just because of where I live on the earth, the latitude I am. Another location might require a different depth of cut here. Even though it's freehand, I am trying to hold the saw table flat and steady. We'll talk more about that up ahead here. Now to get the cut on the opposite side, I just use a real thin tape measure. It bends easier than a big fat tape measure. And I hook it into each cut I've already made and just pick out a number that's roughly halfway. Mark it, measure from the other side, same distance, mark it. And right between the two lines is the center. On these curved surfaces with a metal tape measure like that, it's a challenge to make sure you hook it in and pull it and measure the same way every time. This depth here is just the minimum. It's the size of a unistrut beam plus a little bit more.
I did not mention that there would be any torch cutting, but I have it. It's quick and easy. If there's no torch available, I would have just drilled a series of smaller holes across that gap to break the metal out.
In other words, the cut doesn't need to have a smooth edge. Now in this next step, I'm going to be fitting the beam with the truss into this slot. And I want it to be a snug fit. So you'll notice that when I made these cuts, I stayed inside the white line to keep the size tight. So they were all a little bit too tight in the end, and I had to kind of go back in and shave off a bit more until I got the right feel. Not too tight, but just tight enough. Too tight could distort and damage the unistrut channel shape, which could weaken it. If it is too tight, then I slide it around in there and pull it back out, and then it leaves marks behind on these edges to see where the high places are that need to be shaved down. And before I begin to make those cuts on this pipe, I'm trying to imagine that there's a table on top of this pipe for my saw, that green line, so that my saw blade is going down into the pipe and cutting these sides real flat and in line with the unistrut that's going to go in there. It's never perfect when you're freehanding, but I try to get it as close as I can. Now this next step, I'm a real stickler for this. I want all the places where I've cut, drilled, trimmed, whatever, to be smooth, not sharp and cutting people that rub their hands or their skin over it. Nothing sharp is remaining. It's all smoothed off, every place where we did anything.
Doesn't take that much longer to just do it.
One thing I'm trying to do with this project is keep it simple. So you'll see this unistrut here. I need two pieces that are exactly one of these 10-footers cut in half. So we're going to do that. And you'll see this kind of cutting makes very sharp burrs sticking out here, like razor sharp. It's going to cut your skin real easy, so I'm going to clean them up. I can get most of it off with this fine grit sanding disc. And you can get in there with a little chainsaw file and get the corner off, that sharp corner off that edge with a triangle file, a flat file. So there's nothing left that's sharp and is going to cut anybody's skin. The next 5 minutes is all about making this truss we've talked about. But if my plans didn't have a truss in it,
So I wouldn't need to watch this part.
then skip on ahead to the time mark shown and continue from there. The rest of us are going to continue on with making this truss and attaching it to the rack. The first thing is to use an angle grinder with a metal grinding disc on it. Get it kind of flat and smooth. Then grab a similar tool with a fine sanding disc on it and continue on to smooth out the edge of this truss, making sure to really get all the razor sharp corners off. Round them all off. The corrosion is very shallow. It'll clean up pretty good. So now it looks pretty decent. That corrosion came off. It's all rounded off. Ready to go.
Ready to attach to the unistrut beam.
So we first want to mark the beam at the halfway point. But remember, I'm making mine 3 inches offset. So that's actually going to be where my center is. Then I position the truss centered on the lines. And I'm being mindful that this truss shouldn't be so big that it's going to crash into the bottom of the solar panel, or like in this case, bump into a reinforcing beam that goes across the middle of the solar panel.
Some don't have that. Some have black boxes in the middle.
Got to make sure that any truss isn't going to whack and smash into the bottom of anything here on my solar panels. Now I want to secure the truss in place with a couple of vice grip clamps. But wait, before I do that, I need to grind the galvanizing zinc coating off of 6 places here where I'm going to weld. It has to be steel to arc weld. It can't have that zinc coating. So I use this sanding disc to gently grind off the zinc coating wherever I need to weld. But if I didn't have a welder or didn't want to weld, I could instead drill the 4 holes shown there, maybe 3/8 inch bolts, then 1 bigger hole, 1/2 inch hole in the middle for the pivot. But this hole, we're not going to do it right now. I'm going to take care of it up ahead here. I just wanted to be sure to leave some room for it. But I do want these 2 bolts to be close in and low profile so they'll fit inside of the pipe, even when it's being tilted. So then, no welding is required. Just drill the holes, paint it, and bolt it together. So I'm choosing to weld the truss on. I'm going to use flux core welding, not quite MIG. There's no gas. So mainly here I'm just tacking on the plate to the beam with little short tack welds. Then I'm going to go back and make all the welds longer. And there's 6 welds overall. So welding seems so quick and easy, but really it ends up being a lot of cleanup and paint work to restore the galvanized protective coating so these parts don't rust. The other bummer is that this kind of welding where it's flux core, there's no gas involved, is that it splatters really bad everywhere. Little tiny blobs of welding splatter are slightly stuck on all over the place. Another undesirable effect of welding is that the galvanizing zinc coating burns off on the other side of where I was welding, and it just turns into this white powder that has no rust protection anymore. It's all got to be brushed off and repainted. And on these 3 welds, it's hidden back behind the trough. The welding heat has gone through the metal and burnt the other side, galvanizing off. You just can't see it here. It's in the trough. So looking through my stuff, I found this one old stainless steel brush that has the bristles kind of bent over the sides like this. Well, that little curl over the side is just perfect to fit up in the trough of this beam and get that white powder burnt zinc out of the trough so it can be repainted. I'll just smooth things up a little bit here and knock off the last bit of welding splatter.
Alright, the last machining work that needs to be done is to drill the 1/2-inch hole in the center. And here I'm marking out the holes where I'm going to drill.
And oh yeah, you folks who skipped on ahead to this point because you weren't going to make a truss, welcome back. Here we go. So if you don't have a truss and you see one in the picture here, just ignore it. It doesn't matter.
Well, the top of the pole also needs a 1/2-inch hole through it, so I'm going to mark it. I'm going to start off by drilling a small pilot hole at first, and then work my way up to the final size. The next size up is a 3/16. Same idea here on this beam. Drill the holes, starting out with a small drill, work my way up. And I have a little cup of cool water there that I periodically dip the drill bit into, and that keeps the drill bit cool, so it will stay sharp longer. And when I get up into the final big sizes, like this 1/2-inch drill bit, I turn the speed of the drill down and turn the clutch on a little, so if it binds up and twists, it'll clutch out instead of twisting my wrists. Ouch!
And I like deburring my holes, so I use a bigger drill bit and just lightly chamfer the beginning of the hole to smooth off the sharp burr.
Same on the inside of the hole. If there's a burr there, I'll use this little stone. This one came in a pack of different sizes and shapes, and they're just a light-duty hardware store item. Perfect for this job. And it's doing the same job here. It's taking the sharp burr off the backside of these drilled holes.
So this is what I'm using to paint over the bare steel and messed up galvanizing, so we'll have some rust protection. Their aluminum paint is also good for this job. So remember these 3 places down in here where the welding heat burnt off the galvanized coating. If I could do this over, I wished I would have painted this truss before I had welded it on. I can't get the paint down in between the 2 of them anymore. If it gets wet down in there, it's going to bleed out rust. I could caulk that seam on top and bottom, and that would seal it off from moisture. I'm going to spray down through these holes to get to the 3 places in the trough that the galvanizing got burnt off from welding. I have to spray the paint through these oval holes to get it down through to the trough. There's the middle one there, and then the end one. And I don't care if it's puddling with way too much paint around the hole. I really want to get it down through the hole into the trough. That's a little fun preview of part 2. We'll be digging the holes, placing the poles, mixing a little mud, setting the racks, building the racks, showing off how they tilt so easy.
Oh my.
Well, if you want to see the rest of the story, how it turned out, check in for part 2.
I am not a structural engineer, even though I play one on YouTube.
Ho, 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 ho.